Alrighty, you're on with, this is Mass Hysteria, and we're going to get started with a track by Mix Tour called Imagine of Media.
A major earthquake measuring 7.8 on the Richter scale.
The most contentious issue has been the use of
that we should think twice before taking steps. Secondly,
Can you hear me now? 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 I think these levels are a little bit too high. We're gonna have to turn these levels down. We're gonna have to turn these levels down a little bit. Next, we've got I can't even read that from here. HTR SPLTN. That's the name of the band. Hater Spolton. Maybe, I don't know. But they're gonna be playing My Brain Has Had It. My Brain Has Had It. And we're gonna be hearing an interview. We're gonna be turning those levels down. Actually, let me turn the feed levels down. The interview is with Chris Hedges. It's from a radio show which is entitled Talk Nation Radio.
You mentioned in your piece the late Senator J. William Fulton and his description in 1970 how the Pentagon influenced and shaped public opinion through these multi-million-dollar public relations campaigns. Even then, so we're talking about those ties between the Pentagon, government, and Hollywood producers, and the use of media by the Defense Department for, creation of basically propaganda films. Now we're seeing that maybe that never ended when the Bush administration left Washington, right? It's going on again, but not that it ever stopped, right?
No, anything is only has been accelerated. And this was referring to Fulbright's book in 1970, The Pentagon Propaganda, where he detailed how public opinion is shaped through huge Defense Department, very close ties with Hollywood, and the use of lobbying. You saw a window with various captains, retired four-star in the New York Times story, where he was being used as a CNN analyst at the same time that he was an employee for Defense Solutions Incorporated, a consulting firm, so that on air he not only promoted wars, which directly affected the profit margins of the company worked for, but the weapon systems that they sold. So here you have, ostensibly a dispassionate military analyst calling for the expansion of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the use of specific weapons systems for which he personally made a profit.
Up next, we've got with Hype and thick.
If you are intimately familiar with Iraqi society as I am, because of course the presence of foreign occupation troops is one of the major causes of instability. And we see now a very similar situation to what happened during the Vietnam War with Cambodia, where we are carrying the war over the border into Pakistan because we not only have declared war on the Taliban, but in essence we've declared war on the Pashtuns, 18 million of whom live in Afghanistan, 23 million of whom live immediately over the border into Pakistan, because of course the line was drawn by British cartographers without any respect to tribal areas. And the heavy use of drones, along with the heavy use of American airstrikes, we just had this incident earlier this month where, up to 140 civilians were killed, has really created a situation where we have become the most effective recruiting tool that the Taliban has. And throwing foreign troops into Afghanistan is like dumping gasoline all over the fire. It isn't going to work.
We've heard a lot of different reports on these airstrikes in western Afghanistan that were so devastating to civilians. There was the downsizing of numbers, the blame the U.S. put on Taliban fighters rather than airstrikes, explanations about film from the planes. Now on NPR, we've heard about a poll taken in Pakistan by a conservative organization that showed the majority of civilians there don't support the Taliban, do support military effort in the U.S. In this thread of logic, we have a cause again, much like we did in Iraq, the saving of the people of Pakistan and Afghanistan from the Taliban.
Well, support for the Taliban, I think, is largely propelled forward by the corruption and brutality of the Karzai government. Very similar situation in Gaza, where people walked away from Fatah because they were so brutal and corrupt into the arms of Hamas. There's never been any deep love for the Taliban. Remember, the Taliban were largely our creation during the 80s when there was a battle against the 10-year Soviet occupation. The CIA funded only the most extreme mujahideen elements, which of course became the Taliban. And star secular opposition movements within Afghanistan. It turned out to be a very short-sighted and counterproductive strategy, one largely pushed on the Americans by the ISI, or the Pakistani intelligence service, which was allowed to administer the aid out of Peshawar. So the Afghans are very aware of the fact that it was we, as Americans, who funded, armed, and empowered the Taliban. And that's why there's such deep distrust in Afghanistan of the Americans and their motivations and intentions. But I think it's clear that a lot of the savagery of the Taliban is very unpalatable to large numbers of Afghans. And tragically, what you have in Afghanistan are two different forms of barbarity. One side beheads human beings, throws acid in girls' faces, and the other side drops 1,000-pound iron fragmentation bombs and shiny cluster bombs all over fields where children and innocents are murdered and maimed. And that is the disease of war. But I think we are incredibly naive. We don't understand that in the mix of Afghanistan, there is no moral difference between us and the Taliban.
Between us and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, I think that's who you were referring to.
Hekmatyar received staggering sums of money. He's a creation of the CIA.
And the State Department saw him as a terrorist, still Congress funded.
Now hearing
Yeah.
Easy Matter with Midnight Road.
That's a perfect example of, whoever coined that term, blowback. I mean, he would have been nothing without that. We allowed the Saudis in there. We allowed Wahhabism to come in. We played a major role in distorting not only Afghan society, but Afghan opposition.
If the choice is between them and us, they're choosing them at least much of the last 8 years.
Well, because they're Afghans. I mean, let's not forget the Taliban is an indigenous movement. And we're not. You sort of wonder if these people read history. Go back and look at the failed 10-year Soviet occupation. 15,000 Red Army troops dead. Many, many more maimed and wounded. The client army that reached close to 200,000, completely riddled with corruption, ineffectual. We're repeating the mistakes that, just as we went into Vietnam and repeated the mistakes of the French, we're walking into
suppose the warnings you issue in your books are an answer in and of themselves. But what is the answer in terms of organizing what we have to do here?
Well, if we don't break the back of the permanent war economy, we're finished. And neither of the two main political parties even raise it as an issue. It's not sustainable in terms of its military objectives, but it's also just not sustainable economically. We are exhausting ourselves. Imperiums which have this kind of constant need to expand always do that, to a point where there's going to be a radical kind of deflation because it's not over the long term sustainable. And I think that, almost everything I write is an attempt to at least, in my eyes, get people to grasp the reality around them. I've spent many, many years in war courses, and it's not a matter of being a pessimist or an optimist. It's a matter of understanding what's down at the end of that road and how dangerous it is. And people in war zones who couldn't read the landscape realistically often didn't live very long. And I think that the political mechanisms are largely impotent and bankrupt. And I think you're right, require a kind of organizing and a challenging against the machine system that, if it's done, will ensure our kind of willful self-annihilation.
Christopher Hedges, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Not at all. Thanks for having me.
We've been speaking with Chris Hedges. You can read his weekly columns at truthdig.com. His forthcoming book is Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. We'll hear more.
And we'll hear more from AZ Matter as well, with Calm Mind.
Military-industrial establishment is a very lucrative business, and it's gilded corporate welfare. Talk about the guarantee of profits, even as most of America worries about their pay cuts.
Yeah, well, that's one of the, the most insidious aspects of the permanent war economy. And again, I'm going to have to go back to the person I think who enlightened me to this, Melman, in his research, found that since the end of World War II, the federal government has devoted more than half of all tax dollars to military, current and future military operations. This is by far the largest single sustaining activity of the government. But how does this work financially? And it has become, for the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower originally wanted to call the military-industrial academic complex, which is sort of interesting, an extremely lucrative form of corporate welfare, because defense systems are sold before they're ever produced. And not only that, but military industries are permitted to charge the federal government for gigantic cost overruns, meaning that huge profits are guaranteed. And how do we give more names? Let's say Egypt, where I used to be based for a time. Egypt gets, it's also true of Israel, but gets $3 billion. But they are required, and that is to buy or to spend $1.3 billion of that money on American weapons. So you have this kind of circular route where the taxpayers fund the research and the development and the building of the weapons. And then they give money to the government to buy them back. It defies any semblance of, free market economics. And what happens to these weapons? Well, they're very soon in need of being updated and, of course, replaced by a new generation of weapon systems that are always more sophisticated and more costly. So they end up, being hauled off to the desert where they're left to rot. In economic terms, it's a completely dead end. It sustains nothing except the permanent war economy. And that virus has, at this point, I think, gone extremely far in hollowing out American society from the inside. That we are a country that, because it's in a permanent economy, is not restricted or controlled by normal economic rules of producing goods. I'm talking about the large corporations that have made this unholy alliance, essentially turn the government, the federal government, to a kind of partner in this process. They don't produce goods and sell them for a profit and then use the profit for further investment and production. So they operate completely outside of the whole concept of competitive markets. There are no competitive markets. They've erased the line between the state and the corporation. And what they've really been able to do, and of course through lobbyists, sophisticated public relations, the Pentagon spends millions and millions of dollars a year making sure that we have a particular image of not only the world but of the military. It leaches away the ability of the country to manufacture useful and sustainable products and create sustainable jobs. Melman cited the example of the New York City Transit Authority in 2003 when it allocated $3 to $4 billion for new subway cars. So the New York City asked for bids, and there weren't any American companies that responded because these large manufacturing concerns have found a much more lucrative deal integrating themselves into the permanent war economy. So that the corrosion, the corruption of the industrial base is one that diverts resources from items that maintain or improve the economy and the nation's infrastructure. And what happened? Well, finally, New York City had to contract with companies in Japan and Canada to build its subway cars. Now, this contract alone, directly and indirectly, would have created about 32,000 jobs in the United States. And that's just a small example of what happens repeatedly in a permanent war economy, in an economy that has been completely distorted.
This is incentive with peasant.
They say in business, what gets measured gets done.
To stop it ever happening again, they set out to find ways to control this hidden enemy within the human mind. At the heart of the story are Sigmund Freud's daughter, Anna, and his nephew, Edward Bernays, who had invented the profession of public relations. Their ideas were used by the US government, big business, and the CIA to develop techniques to manage and control the minds of the American people. Those in power believed that the only way to make democracy work and create a stable society was to repress the savage barbarism that lurked just under the surface of normal American life.
North, in your work at the NSC, were you not assigned at one time to work on plans for the continuity of government in the event of a major disaster? Mr. Chairman.
I believe that question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area, so may I request that you not touch upon that, sir?
I was particularly concerned, Mr. Chairman, because I read in Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed by that same agency, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution. And I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he had worked.
May I most respectfully request that that matter not be touched upon at this stage. If we wish to get into this, certain arrangements can be made when executive session.
Tell you how to get whatever you want.
called Empire of Illusion, the End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle. And it is about living in a non-reality-based belief system, failing to grasp what's happening around us. Across the cultural spectrum, you see it, that belief that we can be anything we want to be, you know, whether that's given to us by Jesus, whether it's Oprah, finding our inner strength, self-help gurus. It's certainly part of corporatism. Reality is never an impediment to what you want. And in a time of collapse, that becomes very dangerous because the chasm between what is real and what you think is real widens to such an extent that I think eventually dictates a kind of deep existential shock. And it is an attempt to juxtapose the illusion of who we think we are as a country and a people with who we really are.
And in your piece in Truth Dig, The Disease of Permanent War, you write, citizens in a state of permanent war are bombarded with the insidious militarized language of power, fear, and strength that mask an increasingly brittle reality.
I have to go back and lean pretty heavily on the great scholar Seymour Melman in books like Pentagon Capitalism, where he described in great detail the huge expansion of the defense military industry following the Second World War. He actually calls the defense industry viral, and explains how this sort of state of permanent war, which has existed for the last few decades, has upended priorities. It's redirected government expenditures, of course half of all discretionary spending, to gigantic military projects. And the consequence of that is that domestic investment has been diminished and starved in the name of national security, so that we can produce these sophisticated fighter jets like the F-22, and Boeing is unable to finish commercial planes on schedule. We roll out one M1 Abrams tank after another, and our automobile industry is going bankrupt. We divert grants and money and research funds into the development of weapons, and we fail to build the technology of renewable energy to fight global warming. Universities, and I've taught at Princeton and Columbia and NYU, are completely awash. Defense-related grants at Princeton, my understanding is the entire robotics department is funded by the defense industry. And, not only are the humanities withering away, but things like environmental sciences are not being funded. These are all consequences of a society that has descended into what Melman, I think, correctly calls a state of permanent war. I mean, we're spending now, if you count VA, nuclear research, and everything else, we're up at almost $1 trillion a year. The stated defense budget is about $23 billion, and according to the CIA, the second largest expenditures by any country on defense is $65 billion, which is China. All we have to do is look around to see the disintegration, the physical disintegration that the permanent war economy visited on the country. Bridges and levees collapsing, schools decaying, domestic manufacturing base virtually destroyed, staggering debts, the callousness by which we treat the weak, the poor, the mentally ill, the sick, the unemployed. All these sacrifices are somehow supposed to be necessary in the name of national security. And when you live, as we do, in a state of permanent war, you are bombarded by people, of course, for whom this is a huge profit-making enterprise, with the militarized language, power, fear, strength that I think is used to mask this sort of gradual collapse. And that's what's affected the country. We have these large corporations who push the doctrine of permanent war, kind of upended or tweaked Leon Trotsky's doctrine of permanent revolution. It's just permanent war, but the effect is the same, which is to keep us afraid, so that we don't object to the bloated military budget, so that we don't ask the unpleasant questions of those in power, and that we're willing to have our rights and liberties stripped from us. And it's all part of the same and very frightening package, which I think Melman was one of the first to sort of begin to understand.
And up next, we got a little short segment, Collapse Party Stages of Collapse, as well as Incentive with Got the Nails. And then
Stage
after that,
one.
I am not aboard
Financial
the ship
collapse.
anymore.
Faith in business as usual is
I am
lost.
not
The
aboard
future is
this
no longer
ship
assumed
anymore,
to resemble the past in any way that allows
which
risk to be
is
assessed
by someone,
and financial
I'm
assets
not
to be
exactly
guaranteed.
sure who.
Financial institutions become insolvent, savings are wiped out, and access to capital is lost.
Stage 2.
Commercial collapse. Faith that the market shall provide is lost. Money is devalued and or becomes scarce. Commodities are hoarded. Import and retail chains break down. And widespread shortages of survival necessities become the norm.
Stage 3.
Political collapse. Faith that the government will take care of you is lost. As official attempts to mitigate widespread loss of access to commercial sources of survival necessities fail to make a difference, the political establishment loses legitimacy and relevance.
Stage 4.
Social collapse. Faith that your people will take care of you is lost, as local social institutions, be they charities or other groups that rush in to fill the power vacuum, run out of resources or fail through internal conflict.
Stage 5.
Cultural collapse. Faith in the goodness of humanity is lost. People lose their capacity for kindness, generosity, consideration, affection, honesty, hospitality, compassion, charity. That's a quote from Turnbull, the Mountain People. Families disband and compete as individuals for scarce resources. The new motto becomes, may you die today so that I die tomorrow. That's from Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago. There may even be some cannibalism.
How people feel about France, how they relate to France, like if they what France's personality is.
And if you fill them, they're filled to a market of unlimited, ever-changing needs, dominated by self-expressiveness, that products and services can satisfy in an endless variety of ways, and ways that change all the time. And consequently, economies have unlimited horizons.
I have to say, I am not a conspiracy theory aficionado. I really don't. I'm allergic to conspiracy theories. I think that an awful lot of what's happened to us has been a totally consensual thing, in the sense that the American public went along with whatever their leaders or corporate plutocracy wanted them to do. So it's been a completely consensual trip the whole way. But the American public is certainly going to be greatly disappointed when things really don't hold together and they discover, well, there aren't going to be hydrogen cars and there is no realistic way of putting up the hydrogen filling stations all over America, and we're probably just not going to be able to drive as much as we did, if at all. So these things are going to come as huge disappointments to the nation.
Also got some other random clips from previous shows mixed in here.
There is despair. There is despair, Mr.
What we have to do here.
Well, if we don't break the back of the permanent war economy, we're finished. And neither of the two main political parties even raise it as an issue. It's not sustainable in terms of its military objectives, but it's also just not sustainable economically. We are exhausting ourselves, and imperiums which have this sort of constant need to expand always do this, to a point where there's going to be a radical kind of deflation because it's not over the long term sustainable. And I think that, you know, almost everything I write is an attempt to, at least in my eyes, get people to grasp the reality around them. You know, I spent many, many years as a war correspondent, and it's not a matter of being a pessimist or an optimist. It's a matter of understanding what's down at the end of that road. And how dangerous it is.
You abandoned me. Love don't live here anymore.
This is Solar with Not Here Anymore.
There is despair, Mr. President, in the faces that you don't see. Maybe, Mr. President, if you stopped in at a shelter in Chicago and spoke to the homeless there. Maybe, Mr. President, if you asked a woman who had been denied the help she needed to feed her children because you said you needed the money for a tax break for a millionaire or for a missile we couldn't afford to use.
And here's AZ Matter with Expansion.
The people are in charge. The people's desires are in charge. The people are not in charge. The people exercise no decision-making power in the environment. So democracy is reduced from something which consumes an active citizenry to something which now increasingly is predicated on the idea of the public as passive consumers. The public as people who essentially what you're delivering them are doggy treats.
It was, in a sense, the triumph of the self. It was the triumph of a certain self-indulgence, a view that everything in the world and all moral values was appropriately used for the lens of personal satisfaction. Indeed, the ultimate ending point of that logic is that there is no society. There is only a bunch of individual people making individual choices to promote their own individual well-being.
Well, that's another difference between the Soviet Union and the United States that turned out to be to the advantage of the Soviet Union, which is American propaganda is very good. There's all this advertising, all this marketing, you know, seducing people and doing things that are bad for them. And Soviet propaganda was heavy-handed, it was kind of ugly, and it was not seducing people, it was trying to basically harangue and browbeat people into doing things that were good for them. Now it turns out that human nature is such that people won't respond very well to that treatment. Humans like to be seduced. They like to be, you know, cajoled, and they like to do things that are bad for them if somebody tells them that that's okay. So, in terms of that, you know, Soviet propaganda pretty much made people kind of think for themselves a little bit, you know, and American propaganda kills that. You know, so you have very few people in this country. You know, there's all this talk about individualism, but really it's very much a, you know, a herd mentality kind of country, where everybody thinks that, you know, it's okay to have credit cards. It's okay to, you know, max out your credit. It's fine. That's what everybody's doing. And the thing is, I've seen a lot of just really horrendous suffering, you know, and so I can't really be sort of lighthearted about it. Oh, you know, capitalism is going to fall apart. People are not going to be exploited anymore. You know, how wonderful. You know, the fact is that, you know, it's going to be really painful to watch. You know, and that's the part that I don't like about it.
Up next, we've got OD with Through the Wire.
It's so much longer than last year.
It is. Nearly 4 inches longer in some months.
Turn the music up in the headphones.
Turn me up some.
I think that you mentioned Citizens United, and we hear that term a lot. People hear about unlimited corporate money. Can you give a little more detail on that? What exactly is that going to mean for someone running for office, and how does that change the game? It seems like we were pretty money drenched already before that decision.
Well, before that decision, corporations could not give checks from corporations like General Motors or Kennecott Copper straight to independent, nonprofit
Ralph Nader on Citizens
who then can oppose members, people who are running for office or running for re-election. Now, they can pour millions of dollars into these committees, and they can oppose or push for local candidates, state candidates, national. And here's how it works, although it actually has this story as a happy ending. Oklahoma City Council race a few weeks ago. There are 7 or 8 members of the City Council. This was a runoff for one City Council seat that pays 12,000
White Girls
and a surgeon by the name of Ed Shadid, famous Oklahoma family whose great uncle started the whole prepaid health insurance movement that preceded Kaiser Permanente and Puget Sound, and had the first hospital co-op run by farmers in the country. Anyway, he's running. He's for president. And actually, he ran a green ticket for a candidate 2 years earlier. Anyway, he's running against the Democrat choice and in the runoff. And the Democrat spent almost $1 million, but it wasn't his money. It was secret money through these committees. So it was like a dry run of what we're going to see in 2012, but not just at the federal or state level, at the local level. Fortunately, Dr. Shadid was a very compelling candidate. He knocked on door after door. He had very, very enthusiastic volunteers, and he won by a margin of 2 to 1. But it's hard to do that citywide. It's hard to do that statewide. It's even harder to do that nationally. But that's what's coming.
Now, Ralph, when you say secret money, so Corporation X wants to donate money, it can be kept secret so the public doesn't know Corporation X is donating money?
That's correct.
And that's protected by the Constitution now, according to the
according to 5-4 Supreme Court. By the way, that was his major issue. I think he got a lot of votes because he kept saying to his opponent, disclose the secret money, his bankrolling. Who's behind it? Come on. Why are they ashamed to tell the voters in my district? So that's the counter you can see coming in. But the trouble is, what if they're both candidates, Republican and Democrat, are getting from the same reservoir? They're not going to blow the whistle for that because they're getting their own type of secret money.
It seems also, Ralph, that a lot of this money goes to pay for television advertising. What is your sense of the quality of information that comes through on these TV ads?
It's garbage. It's manipulation. There was once a famous executive of Conan Beldy, big Madison Avenue advertising firm, and he told me, it was actually on the Today Show, that he was advising Nixon on one of the campaigns, President Nixon, and he said that he wasn't going to do it anymore because there should be a law. Listen to this, from a major advertising executive who knows about some. He said there should be a major law that prohibits any campaign ad less than 5 minutes duration. So basically, you have these
this is Rozzy with We Are All Children of God.
Heavily devoid of content.
And up next, Rozzy
easily impregnated with
deceptive
signals, sounds, images, and the rest of it, music, and they're junk. They shouldn't be allowed. Certainly not on the public airways, which belong, as we all know, to the people of this country. They're the landlords. Radio and TV stations are the tenants. They don't pay the FCC a dime for their license, so they get our property free 24 hours a day. We can certainly condition the license, and not just for we can give a certain amount of free time.
to ballot qualified candidates and reduce the pressure on them to raise special interest money in order to buy ads. But also, we've got to go further. I don't know whether you've ever had a workshop in your conference, but we ought to go further and say, what are the people getting by way of reciprocity for having to give away a multi-billion-dollar asset 24 hours a day called the public airways? And my answer to that is that we, the audience, should get an audience network with a certain amount of time every day on all licensed TV and radio stations. And we should have the budget come from the license fee that the commercial stations have to pay, so that we have our own studios, reporters, producers, and your conference would be beamed live over the air to millions of people. The other reciprocity, which I have not seen talked about, is that the license is conditioned by, say, the Chicago, all the television, radio stations, where they have to periodically put a notice on TV or over the radio, inviting people to join a national, regional, and local organization of listeners and audiences. So that there's a lobby that's built up, so that many of the reforms you and John Nichols have been proposing in book after book and interview after interview will have real power. But you see, we have to raise our expectation level. You know, they control us because we don't even think that the definition of freedom is not just using the remote and clicking off a TV program we don't like and moving to another. It's having power to saying we want some of our property back.
The original idea had been that the liberation of the self would create new kinds of people, free of social constraint. That radical change had happened. While the new beings felt liberate, they had become increasingly dependent for their identity on business. The corporations had realized that it was in their interests to encourage people to feel that they were unique individuals and then offer them ways to express that individuality. A world in which people felt they were rebelling against conformity was not a threat to business, but its greatest opportunity.
The thing is that you talk to these big industrialists and they say, well, we're interested in farming efficiency. Well, it depends what you mean by efficiency. If you're interested in money, efficiency defined in terms of money, then the system is very efficient. Because they've cut out all the labor, which means they've cut out most of the costs, which means that they're getting huge and they're putting in loads and loads of fertilizer, which means they're getting very, very big yields at very little cost. And in cash terms, it's very efficient. So what we should be talking about, if we're interested in seriously in feeding people, and if we're talking about the long-term future, is biological efficiency. In other words, how much energy you're putting in compared with how much energy you're getting out. And how sustainable it is. You know, can we really go on farming in this kind of way in 100 years, 1,000 years, 10,000 years? If the answer to that is no, then it's not efficient at all. So you see, you see what I mean? I mean, we need exactly the kind of farming that the present industrialists are doing their best to destroy. We need lots of people on the land. We need basically agrarian societies. We need very, very mixed agriculture, whereas these people are trying to create monocultures. And Indian agriculture is designed to produce food, which is entirely different from agriculture that's designed simply to produce money. And that's my long answer.
One of the uses of the 20th century was that we found out things that don't work. For instance, huge centrally planned economies where the government tells everybody what to do all the time. Those proved to be a bad idea in a lot of ways. However, that doesn't mean that what does work is everybody doing exactly what they want to and no one ever trying to get together as a community and figure out what makes sense. That's as ideologically extreme and as unlike sort of where human beings have come from as sort of Marxist collectivism was. What we need are things that sound and are normal. Communities, neighbors, people figuring out how to do things together.
That's what, government at its best is. And there were some tasks that only government can perform.
We're going to need to deal with climate change, One of my
one of the places where I lost a lot of respect for libertarians in the last decade was that they became in many ways
scientific denialists about global warming. All you had to do was read the webpage of the Cato Institute or Reason magazine. And one of the reasons was that the chemistry and physics conflicted with their ideology. I mean, the syllogism became markets solve all problems, markets aren't solving global warming, therefore global warming isn't a problem. That's poor logic, but it's emotionally comforting if you're the kind of person who needs some abstract ideological system, Marxism, Leninism, Randian objectivism, whatever it is, to order your life. For the rest of us, what we need is trying to figure out what scale to solve what problems at. And some of those are solved individually, and some of them are solved in your neighborhood, and some of them are solved internationally. And it's not as comforting as having a one-size-fits-all explanation for everything. On the other hand, those don't work.
This is Water Dog White with Dog Fights a Well-Lighted Black Market.
LSD, along with Buddhism and psychology, but particularly LSD, the other two wouldn't have even happened, was the Great Awakening for me. I was a rural kid living in a small town, and I'd read about it when I was in the 9th grade and wanted some. And I'd read about it in Life magazine, this terrifying drug, and hell, I'd never even smoked a cigarette in my life, but I wanted some. And anyway, it finally came along. Johns Hopkins, a friend of mine who was being treated for his homosexuality with LSD. Man, we continued his treatment as long as we could possibly push it. And he would bring it.
And it was legal. It was the first 3 years I took it. It was legal. And
From the very first time I took it, for once I saw the world, and I saw how malleable reality was. And when it was done, I sat and cried because I knew life could be this thin. I knew there was more meaning there. There was more to be felt, lived, and to be, And so nothing was ever the same after that because I had applied myself like so many other people, not because it was LSD. Same way with ayahuasca. Until very recently, I had a big refrigerator full of it. And I haven't taken it years, but there seems to be a lot of interest in it. Anyway, the expansion of consciousness, you have to call it that, realizing how malleable and that reality is a consensus agreement between people, You could also agree on something else than capitalism and brutal commuting and murdering each other psychologically for jobs. It's possible to agree on something else, and maybe that's why I like the third world in my later years, is that they have agreed on something else.
All right, that wraps it up for tonight with Mass Hysteria. I'm your host, Jack, and you all have a good night.